Hello, and welcome back to the Atlantic Council's IMF World Bank Week programming. I'm Alisha Chhangani, an assistant director here at the GeoEconomics Center, and today we're live at the IMF headquarters to talk about how the IMF is navigating fragmentation in the global economy. I'm very excited to introduce our panelists today. We have Tran, senior fellow at the GeoEconomics Center, and we also have Patrick Ryan, who is a Bretton Woods 2.0 fellow at the GeoEconomics Center. Both of you guys are former IMF, so I'm sure this conversation is going to be very, very interesting. I'm going to start with you, Pat. For the last 6 months, you have been writing on this very exact topic, how the IMF is navigating fragmentation in the global economy. So talk to me a little bit about that. Set the stage. What is the current stage of global economic integration right now?
Sure. Thanks for having us, Alisha. I think, when the Bretton Woods system was founded 80 years ago, it kind of set the stage for this massive increase in global economic integration. You saw trade openness increase drastically up until about the financial crisis, at which point trade on a global level has more or less flatlined. And following COVID-19 and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, what you're actually starting to see is net negative capital flows as well in emerging market and developing countries. Granted, there's a lot of difference in composition there, where you see China has been having net negative flows, other countries are starting to see positive flows. But I think maybe the most worrisome thing in terms of global economic integration and the Bretton Woods institutions as a whole is the increase that you're seeing in policy interventions across the board. Whether it be industrial policy, trade restrictions, or increasingly the use of capital flow management measures or capital controls. And so all in all, it seems like the tides are shifting in terms of the direction of where the global economy is headed next.
I think that's super interesting. That's really going to frame our conversation today. Hang, I'm going to turn to you. We've been talking a lot about the global financial safety net. Pat, this is in your research a lot. So I want to ask a little bit about how you think fragmentation is going to impact the global financial safety net, and how has it impacted it so far?
Thank you very much. That's a very good question, but I will answer it by looking at the real factor behind the fragmentation, and that is the lack of mutual trust among major countries. That will really be required for any cooperation on an international scale to be feasible. So if there's no trust because of geopolitical competition and contention, then countries will try to make alternative arrangement for themselves. And we see that well before the term deglobalization or fragmentation become popular. Back in the Asian crisis, 30 years ago, many Asian countries aspire or try to come up with alternative arrangement. They try to launch under Japan's proposal, Asian Monetary Fund, but it was shut down. But they, at the end, come up with the Chiang Mai initiative, which they multilateralized and has become a very significant part of the global safety net. So this lack of trust have led to countries to try to mend for themselves by raising the foreign exchange reserve that they keep for themselves. So altogether, emerging market countries now have huge amount of reserves in the trillions of dollars. It is not cost-free because those money could have been used to finance investment that can increase the productive capacity of the country to help them grow. But instead, they are kept and put in paper, US Treasury bonds, to be there for the rainy days. So it's a very wasteful use of resources, but they feel that they need to do it to be safe.
Right.
So you have a series of reserves by individual countries. You have regional arrangement like the Chiang Mai initiative that I talk about. You have also in Europe, after the European debt crisis 10 years ago, the European Stability Mechanism, which already has €500 billion of lending power, which is almost half of the size of the IMF, to help European member of the Euro area when they are in that crisis. So you have that, but the most important provider of the global safety net turned out to be the US Central Bank, the Fed, because the world is depending on the dollar, and only the Fed can be the lender of last resort for dollars. So when there's a crisis, particularly dollar liquidity crisis, the Fed eventually has to come in and to open up swap lines between itself and the counterparts to stabilize financial markets. And exactly that's what the Fed did in the great global financial crisis in 2008. So I think that altogether we have a fracture fragmented, splinter global financial safety net. The IMF is only one part of it with less than $1 trillion of money, but only one part. And the task facing the IMF is to try how to work, cooperate with the other providers of resources and safety net to coordinate so that they can together act in a more coordinated fashion when the needs come to help countries stabilize the crisis.
That makes sense. And Hung, this might be a very direct question, but my question to you is the IMF still central to the global financial safety net? Do you still think so?
It depends on what the central say and depends on group of countries. For the big countries, the US, the Euro area, Europe, China, the IMF has become less central in the sense that those countries have strong economic activities. Like China, they have huge amount of reserves. The US is the country that issuing the US dollars. So those countries probably do not need the IMF funding, except for a few smaller European countries. So for the big members, the IMF is not important in terms of financing, but I think the IMF can still play an important role in providing the analysis, the policy advice, and the kind of the consultation that they do every year with members to help them set the right policy without negative spillover on other countries. However, for developing countries, particularly low-income countries, the IMF has become the life for those countries.
Patrick, do you agree with Hung, disagree? What's your thought on this?
I mean, I think that's spot on in the sense that you're really kind of seeing, one, a fragmentation of the system when it comes to the global financial safety net, but two, a fragmentation for whom the IMF is still relevant and for whom it is not. And it's precisely the emergence of these swap lines and regional financing arrangements, as well as countries choosing to self-insure in the form of building up their foreign exchange buffers, that is making the IMF less relevant for some of these more advanced developed countries. It still is kind of the crux of crisis support for low-income countries.
Right. So you both brought up emerging markets, you brought lower middle-income countries and these self-insurance mechanisms. So they are finding alternatives to IMF lending. So Hung, maybe you can answer this a little bit. How can the IMF stay an attractive source of lending for these countries if countries and markets are turning away from the IMF or looking for alternative sources?
Well, I mean, we are talking about self-insurance, but it's a matter of degrees. Yeah. Even though middle-income countries, developing countries try to increase their holding of reserves, those are finite assets and they are in a crisis. It's not enough to really stabilize the turmoil and the lack of confidence that investors have in that country. So those countries still need the IMF with the stamp of approval when the IMF comes in, agree on a program, and more importantly than the money is the fact that the country will promise to correct the mistakes in their policy making, to make reform, to make their economy more efficient, therefore can produce and generate the revenue from which they can repay their debt. That will open up new additional fresh money coming in from investors, have more confidence in the country. So the stamp of approval of the IMF is still something important for countries to secure.
That's very interesting, the stamp of approval, I like that. So, Pat, my question for you is, there's also, concerns about fragmentation, making it harder for, global development prospects, and countries are still turning to the IMF for funding, but there have been concerns about the IMF not being equitable, inclusive to all countries. You bring this up in your research, in the global financial safety net, sub-Saharan African countries don't have access to financial arrangements as well. So can the IMF kind of step in that area and provide that access, and how can it do it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult issue to address, and I wouldn't be the first if I said more cooperation is needed at the IMF or more cooperation is needed at any global organization. But it is precisely that lack of cooperation that actually Hung mentioned in some of his introductory remarks that is, I think, facilitating this difference in kind of outcomes for emerging market and developing countries and versus advanced economies. But I think the core issue and what drives kind of this divergence in outcomes or what could be a potential divergence in outcomes is the idea of the timeliness of the support and the idea of the cooperation of different support mechanisms, right? And so IMF lending is still so crucial for many emerging market and developing countries when it comes time to get support during an economic crisis. But the problem is there's a long, protracted process that, because of the lack of cooperation, has actually made it even worse in terms of developmental outcomes for these countries. And that's because their creditors are taking longer to agree to finance assurances, which is a key pillar that the IMF is required to have before it can lend to these countries. And so the drawn-out time to receive funds because of lack of cooperation is a big issue. And it's really trying to figure out how the IMF can still support these countries in a timely manner despite having this cooperation deficit.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm going to kind of shift gears a little bit and talk a little more about different, prospects for the IMF to think about. Climate change, rapid technological development have been new challenges that emerging markets, but economies around the world are facing. And these weren't issues when the IMF was first established, with issues that the IMF wasn't thinking about then. In your opinion, do you think that the IMF should expand its role to address these issues, especially when countries are addressing them in very different ways, whether that be climate change or emerging technology and things like that?
I mean, obviously, those meta trends have a role to play at a place like the IMF. And I actually think it was Jay Shambaugh in the Atlantic Council event a few weeks ago who really said it best, which is that the IMF should be concerned with these issues insofar as they are macro critical to the development outcomes of their membership. And climate change inevitably will have macro level impacts. Emerging technology increasingly looks to be the same. And so in the surveillance and program operations of the IMF, it is crucial to have a key grasp on how exactly those trends are impacting economies and to develop thought leadership on exactly how these types of these trends and these technologies could support better developmental outcomes or how to kind of manage the losses that could come from climate change. Importantly, I think there's a distinction that needs to be made across Bretton Woods institutions, which takes advantage of kind of the comparative skill sets of different institutions. And so when it comes to things like lending for climate resilience on a project basis, historically that is something that the World Bank is better suited because of its infrastructure to support. And so I think better cooperation across the institutions on how to best address these challenges is needed, but certainly should be something that the IMF is thinking about and working on.
Hung, do you agree, disagree? Any additional thoughts on that?
Yeah, just want to add a few things. Basically, we have the IMF and the World Bank, and they should really cooperate together, but each should focus on their mandate and their core strength. So things like lending long-term for countries to build solar panels, to build windmills, to develop green energy facilities should be left to the World Bank. The fund should not touch that. But the fund should focus on analytical work, analysis, to calculate and to point out the potential cost, damages of climate change, the risks that they represent to economy and financial institutions, and to work with members to help them deal with those risks and problems and incorporate that into their assessment of economic prospect and policy making. For example, the fund should focus more on things that they can raise. The managing director has put something forward this week to say that in terms of raising money for climate activity, countries should really look at the subsidies that they currently provide for fossil fuels. Altogether in all countries in the world, those subsidies amounted to $7 trillion, which is a huge amount of money, increasing from $5 trillion just 10 years ago and rising to $8 trillion in 2030. So the fund look at that, make analysis, and suggest that by reducing the amount of subsidy to fossil fuels, one, you reduce emission of CO2. Second, you can free up to $4.4 trillion, with which you can really reallocate to green mitigation and climate transition activities. So I think these are the kind of things that the fund should focus on and really incorporate it in their analysis, in their program, and their advice to members, not lending long-term to build green energy facilities.
Okay, I understand. kind of a follow-up question here. What sort of like metrics or indicators would you both use to kind of see if the IMF is fulfilling this specific role effectively?
It's a difficult question. I mean, I don't think there's any one key metric that you can really look at, but I think ultimately, obviously, it's a question of how much of the IMF resources are actually being utilized and taking a kind of a broad assessment of what their current lending program looks like. But I also think it's precisely the conversations and kind of discussions that you have at the spring and annual meetings where you really start to hear from the membership about things that they either wish the IMF would do more of or do less of, and it's kind of that consensus building that happens both at the civil society level and government level here during the meetings, as well as more frequently in the boardroom, that can give an assessment. But it's hard to really point out any key metric. I don't know if you have any better ideas on.
It's a very good question that you raised. In fact, to me, there's one key metric that we should judge the IMF with because it is part of their article of agreements and their mandate.
Okay.
And that is to promote the stability of the global economy and financial system and monetary system. That is their core mandate. And a facet of that is to promote a world economic system where the trade and current account imbalances are within control, are not out of kilter, are sustainable, and therefore have the country go on a sustainable growth path. And using that metric, the IMF has failed in the past 70 years in that core metric because we see large current account and trade deficit and surplus imbalances among countries to the extent that in this country, Donald Trump, when he was elected president in 2016 and then become president in 2017, really look at the trade deficit that the US had with China as the key trigger of the series of unilateral action, tariffs, and things that he put on China in order to reduce that trade imbalances. Because he pointed out that that kind of activity is really having a very negative impact on the US, on hollowing out the US industrial base in terms of causing many problems for many communities depending on those activities for livelihood. So I think that the IMF should really try harder and do a better job in working with countries so that every country, when they have trade imbalances, they should engage in a process of trying to correct those imbalances. The deficit country should import less. The surplus country should try the way to diversify their activity and export less. Otherwise, the persistence of trade imbalances continue to be one of the key factors that trigger the distrust and the contention that we see now behind the geopolitical competition.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think the point of global stability and that being the mandate is super interesting. And I'm going to turn to you, Pat, on this because in your research you bring up the shift towards national security as sort of a justification for a lot of the more trade investment restrictions and things like that. So can you talk to me a little bit about that shift in narrative, investment controls, and changes in trade and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly the emergence of national security as kind of a core justification for some sort of distortionary measure, be it an export restriction, an investment restriction, or just a broader kind of regulatory and subsidy approach that is more akin to industrial policy, has risen drastically in the last few years. And you can actually see this if you go back and have a look through an annual report that the IMF publishes for each of its countries, where it assesses kind of the exchange rate and the reasons that certain countries have certain restrictions in place. And you see that national security has grown in prevalence over the course of these years. I think the concerning thing, if I'm looking at it from the perspective of the global system or for that of the IMF, who is the steward of the global system, it's that there doesn't seem to be any guardrails in place in terms of when national security when an action is truly a justified national security action versus when it is more kind of embodying the same tit-for-tat element as some of the more classical trade wars are. And so that's kind of the most concerning issue, but it does continue to grow in relevance as time goes on.
Do you think the IMF should address this topic at all?
Well, I mean, to go back to the Articles of Agreement, again, it's kind of something that they explicitly cannot address. Issues of national security are issues in which the IMF has acknowledged they will not pass judgment on countries. And so you're kind of at a crossroads in terms of how they could begin to address it. But they certainly have to begin to account for the fact that these measures, if left unchecked, will continue to have these distortionary effects at the global level.
Yeah, I mean, to build on what Pat just said, I mean, they really can and should analyze and point out the costs and benefits of those industrial actions, including industrial policies, investment control, trade controls, tariffs, to point out the cost of those actions and where the benefits, to see if the costs are justified by the benefits and what are the benefits, to measure them, make them real. More importantly, as a global institution with 191 members now, the fund also has the job of pointing out the spillover impact of those policies and action on all the countries, particularly developing and low-income countries. They are being hurt by those actions. So the investment control that we talk about and the uncertainty triggered by the geopolitical contention has already reduced the total volume of foreign direct investment big time. So from almost one third now compared with 5 years ago. That hurts low-income country because they really have rely on the foreign direct investment as a way to help them modernize their economy, help increase their productive capacity, and so on. And therefore, the damages have already been done, and particularly to the countries that least afford to have these kind of damages put on top of them. So I think that the fund really has a lot of job, a lot of work to do to basically point out the consequences of all of these actions. They may not be able to prevent it, but they should make clear to everyone that these actions have cost.
It's very interesting. Hung, I'm going to take a full U-turn and sneak in a CBDC question, a central bank digital currency question. We obviously talk a lot about this at the GeoEconomics Center, and you wrote a piece last year saying that CBDCs could fragment the global economy. Can you talk to me a little bit about that? Countries are at different paces when they're developing their CBDCs. There's a lot of fragmentation in terms of regulatory standards. What's the role of IMF and other international institutions in coming in?
It's very difficult because it comes back to the point that I raised at the very beginning of our conversation, lack of trust.
Right.
CBDC or electronic or internet-based payment work best if they are part of a network, if they are made interoperable. Then they work very smoothly without any friction. But to do that, you require trust. You don't really want to put your own payment system, your own economy, your own national currency, and so on, interoperable with a country whom you don't trust, whom you think that they can do malign things against you, or they can, hurt you or do bad things. And therefore, the lack of trust will keep countries to basically keep it among themselves or with a small group of trusted countries. So we have a splintering, again, fragmentation with different group of countries which are interoperable among themselves, but not interoperable with countries outside of that group. So that is number one. And number two, because of that impetus, different countries will evolve and develop the policy and regulatory framework to nurture and to promote these electronic and digital payment mechanism, including CBDC, differently. So eventually we will have different area of regulation, EU, China, and then US eventually will have some. So that will also become another aspect of fragmentation. And that makes the whole thing more difficult to manage, less efficient than otherwise could have been the case, and potential for more conflict in the future.
Yeah, do you see a role of the IMF in kind of helping in that? They've previously have given a lot of help, whether that's advice to countries looking to promote a CBDC or develop a CBDC. Do either of you see a role of the IMF or other institutions coming in and kind of helping calm some of these fragmentation, these regulatory standards?
I think so far the Bank of International Settlement, BIS, has been more on the forefront in terms of working and collaborating with central banks in experimenting, developing test case for CBDC, and also fostering discussion about common framework, regulatory framework. The IMF should support those with more analytical work to
Yeah.
document and to understand better how different CBDC of different countries can work together to promote a more harmonious payment system and not fragmented.
Yeah.
One other thing I might add, I think in
Yeah.
terms of what the IMF could do as well is really on the analytical front also think about best practices, right?
Yeah.
And I think from a policy implementation standpoint, for something as novel as a CBDC or any kind of new emerging technology, part of the drive towards fragmentation is that it's not all geopolitical in nature, and some of it is everybody is trying to build
Right.
regulation from scratch, and that can lead to a lot of different outcomes. And so having an international body that has done serious analytical work on the issue and can put forth ideas of how to best structure and the kind of the considerations you should have in mind when implementing a new CBDC, that's, I think, a critical consideration.
Well, basically, because of its universal membership, the IMF has the power of persuasion.
Yeah.
It can focus the mind of the issue. It can document and present it in an analytical way supported by data and analysis, and therefore can mobilize global public opinion in favor of a certain course of action. Even though, strictly speaking, countries are sovereigns. They, at the end, will do what they decide to do.
Right.
And big countries, of course, will do what they want to do. But the IMF, being a universal organization, can help to raise the issue and put it in a more constructive framework.
Yeah, and I think we both were talking about earlier, we were seeing sessions happening here live about digital currencies and what kind of the next step is. The IMF is making some sort of effort in that way. This is my last question to the both of you, kind of a concluding question. But the last 4 years, we've seen many challenges: COVID-19, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the ongoing conflict in the Middle East, and we have a US election in less than 2 weeks. What are some of the lessons that the IMF should learn, given what's happened so far, and other global institutions should learn so far, and lessons that they should take forward coming to kind of avoid fragmentation in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think in reflecting on particularly, the last 4 or 5 years from the pandemic to now, the key lesson that is always, people at the IMF know well is the next crisis is never predictable. It always is something that you can't quite see coming, or at least the vast majority of people don't see it coming. And I think when I think about how the IMF and the global system fared over the last few years, I think a lot of the big decisions that were made were the correct ones, but the biggest issue was the time it took to get there.
Yeah.
If you think about, the SDR allocations that the IMF had to support many countries facing balance of payments issues, if you think about, most recently the surcharge review that's been made, as well as kind of adjustments to program access and support to Ukraine following Russia's invasion, these were all objectively the right decisions, but I think what you see is that people were calling for them long before they happened. So if I'm the IMF and I'm thinking back, I think my advice is figure out how to get there quicker. And again, it does come down to trust and cooperation, but I think acknowledging that lack of trust is going to be there and for the foreseeable future, and figuring out ways to address that and to still forge consensus is going to be the most critical thing in the years to come.
Yeah, I think Pat raises a very important question, because now with things being telescoped into a short time frame, time is of the essence. So the IMF needs to be more nimble, more flexible, and quicker on its feet. And the program and so on, the approval process, the things that it normally go through to get the money and the advice to the member countries in need should be sped up so that it can be happen more quickly in response to changing circumstances. The fund should also try to be looking forward and kind of, in its own way, do test case and test run to prepare for contingency. So something happened, then it can kind of knew ahead of time what should we do, A, B, C, D, step by step. So instead of being caught in a panic and then waste a lot of time trying to figure out what's going on, what's to be done. Last but not least, it really, again, I raised this point before, use this power of persuasion to really raise the cost to the international community, to the global economy of countries doing things in the name of their national securities. It is their right to do it, yes, but they should be aware of the fallout to their own people, to their own economy, and to the other countries as well.
I think that's a perfect note to end on. Hung, Pat, thank you so much for joining us. I know Pat has a research paper coming out in January, so we're very
Good.
excited. It's all about this
Looking
topic,
forward
and we're
to
very
reading it.
excited. Thank you all so much for joining us. Keep watching all of our events that are happening on the sidelines of the IMF World Bank meetings. Thank you.
So we keep smiling at you.
Yeah.
Good job.
Thank you
Yeah,
both.
well done.
Sorry, I got lost with the track of the questions, but I appreciate it.